The world that we inhabit bears the indelible scars of centuries of colonial violence. The legacy of this historic violation lies at the root of many of today's most intractable problems. Colonization is the military, economic, political, and cultural subjugation of one nation by another. It is the domination of one people by another, and there are few places on Earth fortunate enough to have escaped its reach. For thousands of years, land has changed hands according to the aims and whims of conquering armies. But beginning in the 15th century, the character and scope of this warfare shifted. Europe's genocidal invasion and pillage of the so-called New World was an apocalypse for the continent's original inhabitants. And from the ashes of these ancient civilizations arose capitalism and the modern system of nation-states. Subsequent waves of European expansion saw the colonization of Australia and New Zealand, along with large swaths of Africa and Asia. Some of these colonies were chosen for mass European settlement, while others were delegated as sources of hyper-exploited labor and resource extraction. Colonial borders, drawn up by foreign aristocrats and dignitaries, were agreed upon through diplomatic treaties and internecine wars. Many of these arbitrary lines persist to this day, cutting blindly across tribes and major ethnic groups, scattering peoples like the Kurds and the Tuaregs over multiple states, and planting the seeds for bitter sectarian rivalries and civil wars. Successive national liberation struggles waged in the decades following World War II allowed much of the world to cast off the shackles of the old colonial arrangement. Yet, in case after case, national aspirations for self-determination have been thwarted by the emergence of a new neo-colonial ruling class, whose members remain subservient to the imperial systems of global finance controlled by the colonial masters of yesteryear. That is not to say that older forms of colonialism have disappeared, or that the flames of anti-colonial revolt have died out. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll take a closer look at two such sites of active settler colonialism and anti-colonial resistance, namely the areas around the Great Lakes region that make up the historic homeland of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the militarily occupied territories of Palestine. Along the way, we'll talk to a number of individuals as they share their own experiences of navigating colonial dynamics, fighting for self-determination, and making a whole lot of trouble.
Indians, natives, Aboriginal, there's so many different terms that people use just to address who we are. But I feel that we need to address ourselves the way we believe we should be addressed. And for me, I say, I'm Ganyangehaga. I'm not Mohawk, I'm not an Indian, I'm not an Aboriginal, I'm not, these are all different terms that have come after.
These terms, decolonization and anti-colonial, I had to Google them because I don't use those terms a lot. We have no English term to use but what's there. But in our own language, we have all the words that we need. How to explain it to someone that doesn't have the language is what gets difficult.
Decolonization has become such a buzzword used by a variety of organizations, institutions. I mean, the federal government is using the word. And it certainly has been watered down in the context of universities and academics clinging to this buzzword. But in reality, decolonization is a very unsettling and disruptive force. And so when I think about what that means to me and how I should relate to it as a non-indigenous anarchist, I don't have any straightforward answers. I have some reflections. They're always changing.
Decolonization is a very large and complex issue for me. It involves decolonizing the way we think, the way that we're sort of wired to experience reality and the ideologies in which we are saturated.
And taking steps to rectify the wrongs that were done so that we can have a just and equal society and a rich society, a diverse society, and a society that benefits from the wisdom of indigenous cultures.
For Palestinians, that means the Israeli occupation that started in 1948 should be stopped, and the Palestinian people should have their own rights for freedom, justice, and control themselves, like all nations in the world.
Fundamentally, the Arab world lives in the aftermath of the colonial project. The reason why these states are there is because of colonialism. The borders were drawn up not by the people who lived there, but by Sykes-Picot, by the British and the French. There would be no Israel without colonialism. It is a Western colony in the Arab world. Just like apartheid South Africa was a Western colony in Africa.
Europe treats Israel as a European colony in the Middle East. So in terms of the trade agreements that give it preferable conditions in trading, the arms that are being bought and sold, Europeans are partners in the Zionist project, and they are responsible.
When the West sees Israel, they see themselves. And when the United States sees Israel, they certainly see themselves. It's a state where Western white people came in and threw the native population off the land. It's a little baby America.
Rectifying the wrongs of the colonization of Palestine would, first of all, involve the return of the Palestinian refugees and reparations for the suffering from being ethnically cleansed for their homeland.
Palestinians, when they forced to immigrate from here as refugees, they are 800,000 at that time. It will become around 8 million now, after 70 or 80 years of occupation.
When we're talking about colonialism in relation to the Canadian settler colonial state, I think it's important to understand that the state is not a completed political and economic entity. In fact, the Canadian state is quite weak and vulnerable.
What you need to understand is that if you look at each reservation where we are, you need to poke a hole in that map because we're not a part of Canada and we're not a part of the United States. The Mohawk people are a nation. The whole Haudenosaunee Confederacy are all nations. So what the United States and Canada want to be is they want to be a nation. They want to be like the Mohawks and the Senecas. When they came on their ship, they brought that government and those ideologies with them. They didn't start nothing new. They didn't make up their own language. They didn't make their own government here. They copied ours and brought theirs with them. So they can't say that they're their own nation.
They have no idea what it is to actually listen to us and to listen to the reasons why this land is so important to us. They'll never know because they don't even want to hear what we have to say. To them, it's like it's all about money. Who the fuck gives a shit about what these Indians want with the land? This is their attitude. It's like, oh, sit down and negotiate, sit down and negotiate. What negotiations? You sit down and it's all of what they want and everything that we come back with, the importance of our culture, our land. It don't mean fuck all to them. It doesn't mean a thing to them.
Human history is a steady stream of massacres and bloodshed. But when it comes to scope and scale of atrocities, nothing compares to the colonization of the so-called Americas. What is now tacitly acknowledged as a genocide against the continent's original inhabitants was in fact a series of dozens, if not hundreds, of different genocides carried out against distinct nations by Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British armies, who were aided in this task by the copious and often deliberate spread of European-born diseases. While there's no single definitive figure, most historians estimate that between 50 and 112 million indigenous people were killed during the invasion and settlement of the so-called Americas, or nearly 95% of the local population. Many nations were entirely wiped out. There's also no recorded figure for the number of Africans killed during the 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, but most estimates range from 14 to 60 million. This includes an estimated 2 million people that died on slave ships, only to be unceremoniously dumped into the ocean. The echoes of these crimes continue to reverberate to this day. In the Great Lakes region of so-called North America, Dutch, French, and British colonizers first encountered the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 5 indigenous nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, with a 6th nation, the Tuscarora, joining in 1722. These settlers were fascinated by the Haudenosaunee's system of governance, which was much more sophisticated than any found during that time in Europe. So much so that many of its principles eventually found their way into the US Constitution. Yet despite signing treaties of mutual respect and coexistence with the Haudenosaunee, most notably the two-row wampum or Guswenta, settler populations in the territories now ruled by the American and Canadian states have repeatedly failed to live up to their obligations. This has been the source of sustained tensions and several standoffs that have galvanized Indigenous anti-colonial resistance across Turtle Island.
I grew up seeing land struggles and struggles about land and being involved in it as a child. My mother's family were very, very involved in a lot of political struggles away from the band council system.
I grew up hearing stories from my aunt and everybody about everything that happened. Whenever I really started getting passionate about everything, I was 16, but I got pregnant, so that's what put that off to the side. 10 years down the road, I'm in a place in my life where I can actually do something, and then that's what brought me together with some like-minded people.
We're not following band council, we're not following Canada, and we're not following Quebec. We're following our own rights as Indigenous people, as Native people, as Ganyankehaga people.
We don't all agree on everything, but at the same time, we bring our strengths together.
And we're taking back our land. The mayor of Oka came and brought this proposal and said they want to expand the golf course into the pine forest, where right at the line of where the golf club ends and the pine forest begins, we have a graveyard there of graves that have been there for hundreds of years. And the pine forests are thousands of years old. I mean, the pines are huge. Native people in Ganassadage said, no, you're not building a golf course and tearing up our graveyard and cutting down all the pines. The answer was no immediately, and that's what sparked everything. I didn't go to the meetings in the beginning, but by May, I jumped in a car with a bunch of ladies and we all took off and went to Ganassadage. In my early 20s, I was trying to give my son at the time, who was just only 2-3 years old, a better example of what a role model that I could be. That time came to stand there and say, I'm going to be part of this because now I'm a woman, I'm not a child where my mother had to just bring me. We can't stop fighting for this because land is one of the most important things to Native people. How do you practice a culture when you don't have a land base? How do you survive a culture when you don't have a land base? This is what we use to teach our children and our people. It was just a regular day. It was like really early in the morning. People weren't even really awake yet. There was a few people puttering around, whatever, either fixing a fire or making coffee or doing something, not everyone was awake at the time. And then all I remember this woman telling me is that they just heard cars and car doors, and then they looked up towards the highway because they were in the pines, and they looked up towards the highway. It was just SQ cars just kept pulling up. And then they just started getting out of the cars, fully dressed with all their bulletproof vests and their assault rifles. The women just looked and they were like, what the fuck is going on? And then they just decided to run to the front, and they all locked arms and they stood across the dirt road that came into the pines. And the police were telling them, you have to get out, you have to leave. And they said, we're not leaving. We're not going anywhere. We're staying right here. This is our land. We're not leaving. And of course, they didn't listen to them. Then they just started throwing tear gas. And I think that's when all hell broke loose.
I don't know if you can hear any of that.
Yes, it sounds like shots.
They launched, I don't know, about half a dozen or a dozen canisters of tear gas. There's smoke.
Ivan, from as much as you can see, are the warriors pulling back now?
Everybody was. I mean, we're moving cars, we're moving camps, we're moving people, reporters.
Are those shots, Ivan? Hello?
It was a bloody day at the Mohawk Indian community in Oka, Quebec, near Montreal. Provincial police in riot gear stormed the barricades the Mohawks had set up. There were clouds of tear gas, a hail of bullets, and in the midst of the battle, a policeman was killed.
For us as Ngwehongwe or Native people that have already been here, we have a culture, we have a way of life, and we have a connection. And all of that is a combination of what we stand for and how we stand up for our beliefs. And going as far as having a physical confrontation with police forces, SWAT teams, army, we've done it and succeeded.
You got other people trying to say there's no place for the warriors or no place for weapons and we're all peaceful forever. And that's not how it's supposed to be.
We're not here to kill people. We're here to protect our land. We're here to protect ourselves. And that's always the goal. If it comes to those extreme cases like in 1990, of course people are going to have weapons, but the weapons are not to be used. This is our understanding that we have in our culture. We're not there to hurt. We're not there to kill anybody.
In my belief, I'm traditional, and that's all there is to it. But what comes with being traditional? It comes with the political aspects and it comes with the ceremonial aspects, so we have to take care of both.
Practicing sovereignty is not holding a band card. It doesn't mean anything. It means that you have a number from the government to say that you're registered and you're on their list. Practicing sovereignty is practicing your culture, your beliefs, and you're standing up for what you believe in.
There are few geopolitical conflicts more intractable than the decades-long struggle for the establishment of a Palestinian homeland in the areas claimed by the Israeli state. The fertile lands between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean have been fought over for thousands of years. Their capital, Jerusalem, is considered holy by all three Abrahamic religions: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Zionism, an ideological movement based around the imagined return of Jews to their biblical homeland, Israel, began to pick up steam in the early 20th century. It was seen at the time as a potential solution to the centuries of anti-Semitic persecution the Jewish people had faced at the hands of European Christians. Following the horrors of the Holocaust, in which 2/3 of European Jews were killed. Support within the colonial ruling classes swung behind the establishment of a Jewish homeland. But rather than establish it within the restructured borders of Europe, the Zionist movement was granted a sliver of the Arab world, in an area the ancient Greeks referred to as Palestina. Since then, the Israeli state has methodically expanded its borders while tightening restrictions on its internal Arab population. Under the unquestioned protection of the Trump regime, they have largely abandoned any pretense of seeking a lasting peace for their Palestinian neighbors, seeking instead to increase the pace of settlement construction in the territories they occupied in 1967. But Palestinians displaced during the Nakba of 1948 have never given up their dreams of returning to their homeland. And the brave resistance of the Palestinian people to Israeli occupation is famous all around the world.
I was born in Tel Aviv a long time ago. Growing up, initially I bought everything that I was told, that we, the Jewish people, were constant victims, we'd never harmed anyone. But then, as I was getting close to the age where every Israeli is supposed to go to the army, every Jewish Israeli, I started hearing about things that were happening. And it was incredibly painful. It really ripped up my illusions about, what I was a part of and what my people were doing. And I did not understand much, but I knew that people were fighting for their freedom and we were killing them for it.
Palestine is not just about statehood, it's about the return of the Palestinians to their historic homeland, which is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean.
The Jewish colony in Palestine, the Jewish state, was created by the British, who promised Palestinian land that they had colonized to Jews. So this colonial act, the fact that Britain felt that they could promise this land to whoever they wanted, was the kind of original sin here.
At the same time, the British were crushing popular Palestinian uprisings. Between 1936 and 1939, it's called the Great Revolt, 10% of the male population of Palestine was either exiled or killed. So by 1948, the population was depleted. So that's how 30% of the population of Palestine, which by that time was Jewish, could overpower and displace and disenfranchise and throw out the Palestinian people from these areas.
That the security of the Israeli people will be reconciled with the hopes of the Palestinian people. This brave gamble that the future can be better than the past must endure.
It is a big mistake that the PLO make this foolish Oslo agreement.
The Palestinian Authority, in entering into the Oslo Accords, effectively surrendered its right to armed struggle. And from that moment on, they've worked with the Israeli state to control and actually dampen popular resistance inside Palestine.
They took the rule of local affairs, all the main issues, the borders, the independent state, the settlements, Jerusalem, water, even energy, and 60% of the land keep in the hand of the Israeli occupation. Nothing changed. There is no legal system in the Palestinian Authority. The security forces here, which have different names, different fractions, different brigades, they just, without any kind of law, they arrest people. The Israelis, there is a system, not a real system, but a military system. They charge the Palestinians for any reason a long time.
As long as the Palestinian Authority arrests whoever Israel tells them to arrest, shares intelligence, proves its worth, it's allowed to exist.
If the rule of the Palestinian Authority becomes like this, only take the dirty work from the occupation, it becomes a very corrupted authority.
Thousands of demonstrators advanced on the border fence that separates Gaza from Israel. The Israeli military accused some in the crowd of being terrorists. Soldiers opened fire, killing more than 50 Palestinians, including 8 children.
The Great March to Return is a popular act of resistance that was organized by a large swath of actors within Gaza. It is popular resistance, and it has been slightly misrepresented as somehow being created by Hamas, which it was not.
Many of the protesters that go out every week are not members of Hamas. The people killed are from all political parties, and many are not affiliated with a political party, not to mention the number of children that have been murdered that are not obviously politically affiliated. People go to protest because the situation is unbearable, and they do it even when they're told not to, because they see no other option. There is no other option of a life with dignity right now in Gaza. So it's accepting a life without dignity or trying to fight for a different life.
This decentralized but coordinated actions go back to the First Intifada, which is why the First Intifada was so special. This moment of popular resistance, a groundswell of resistance from all sectors of Palestinian society, regardless of class, gender, everyone was involved.
The Second Intifada started after a few months, become an armed resistance, but they discovered that it cannot lead to anything. Even Hamas, which is dependent on military resistance or armed resistance, found that in order to continue their control, their position, they need to depend on popular resistance. So the First Intifada is a big example for the coming future for the Palestinian community. In the West Bank, I think the situation is going to be Third Intifada, and this situation will not remain as it is for a long time.
There's this continuity of Palestinians resisting occupation since 1948. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian. Obviously, Palestinians live in the West Bank, Jerusalem, which is their capital, and Gaza. And then there are Palestinians living in refugee camps throughout the Arab world and, of course, the global diaspora. This is one people. The Palestinians are one people. The Palestinians know that. The Palestinian revolution is there to break the status quo, and the status quo won't crush them.
Anarchists have a mixed history when it comes to anti-colonial struggle. We are generally critical of nationalism, seeing it as an ideology that allows for the papering over of other contradictions within a given society. According to this line of thought, buried within the national aspirations that animate anti-colonial struggle are the seeds for the reproduction of oppressive hierarchies and ultimately a new state. That said, this criticism has, unsurprisingly, been markedly less common among non-European anarchists with first-hand experience of national oppression. From the famous Indian revolutionary Bhagat Singh to the Cuban revolutionary Camilo Cienfuegos, many prominent anti-colonial figures have either identified as anarchists or drawn inspiration from anarchist teachings. And countless other lesser-known anarchists have participated in struggles for national self-determination, or continue to do so today. From those waged by the Mapuche in Waimapu to the Kurds of Rojava.
So the International Solidarity Movement is international volunteers that come to support the Palestinian popular struggle. Yesterday there were homes under threat of demolition. The volunteers were in the homes with the families trying to, resist them being removed from their homes. There are demonstrations, areas of Hebron that are under Israeli control, Tel Rameda. The children are in constant risk of attack and harassment. The volunteers take the kids to school and bring them back from school.
I see that those activists in solidarity with the Palestinian people gives us hope that we are not alone. Open the eyes of the world about the human rights issues and the oppression happening in Palestine.
I think there's a problem with Western and white particular anarchists, that they're not able to distinguish identity from national aspirations. Anarchists tend to say, well, they're anti-national, so why do you want to fight for a nation state? This is an incredibly facile and white way of looking at things. It is also arrogant. Fanon understood the importance of national liberation struggles, as defined as national liberation struggles, because that is how they were confronted by settler colonial regimes. They were controlled as Bantu, as Algerian Arabs, as Palestinians, as whatever. You become those identities. All of our identities are constructed, but those are the identities in which the Palestinians are acting now.
I feel it's impossible to talk about the dangers right now, of Palestinian nationalism. Palestinians are stripped of their agency to determine so many aspects of their life and their self-determination. When power shifts and Palestinians are in control of their lives and of their land and of their state, then maybe we can revisit this, but I don't feel it's relevant to the current situation.
If you achieve your rights, justice, freedom, and others, you can think how to deal with your neighbor. Maybe united, cooperating, I don't know. But without this solution happening, nothing. The conflict will continue. The more racist Israelis will growing, and the more religious or Salafist under the oppression people in the Palestinian situation.
Palestine is the litmus test of a true revolutionary in this country. And if you're not 100% on board, then shut the fuck up. And that goes for fucking anarchists, and I don't care for any sort of leftist. Shut up and listen to the people on the ground, listen to the people conducting the PDS, listen to the revolutionaries in Palestine. And that's the way you do it.
Don't start something you can't finish, Don't start trying to be something you're not either. So whatever you're good at, find if that's what you're passionate about, and find a way to mix it with your talent so that you're enjoying yourself, because it does get hard. It's emotionally exhausting, and there comes a point where you just have to take a step back and remember to take care of yourself.
Anarchists have to be careful to nuance how they relate to the concept of sovereignty. It shouldn't be fixed. It needs to be a dynamic understanding of the ways struggle demands from non-Indigenous anarchists to constantly rethink and reevaluate their relationship to a set of ideas and practices. Be aware of how whiteness functions in various spaces of struggle. You can be super down, and you can have a great understanding of how whiteness operates in the world, but you don't have control over how people react to your whiteness. So you gotta be humble and understand that no matter who you are, whiteness will always be triggering for some people. So know when to step back, know when to be quiet, and know when just to walk away.
It's the way I envision it is two braids. You have the boat here, and you got all your intermingling and all your people and ideas, and over here we have our braid going on. And people have to realize that it's not just one straight and narrow path that everyone has to take. There's a weaving going on, and we're all connected one way or another.
You have to get away from the colonialism's way of thinking, and you have to start thinking on your own. The main intention is not yourself as the priority. The main intention for this to work is the priority of the other generations coming, that we keep this equality and peaceful practices going for them, not just for me.
Capitalism continues to fuel the aggressive extractive projects snaking across the continent. Anarchists fighting against exploitative processes of capitalism should think about how important it is to link their struggle to anti-colonial resistance. And for many, I think this means rethinking post-revolutionary ideas of industrial societies.
You have to go back to the beginning, to the Royal Proclamation. If we're gonna get rid of Canada, that's where it comes down to. Because if they're not upholding their agreements, then they need to leave. That government system, I'm not saying all non-native people have to leave, but that political structure and that government system need to go.
The Zionist state, Israel, would have to be dismantled, and a new system based on equality, equal rights would have to be created, one in which we could all live together as equals. And I believe that, I know how wonderful that can be because my life is an example of that. So I'm really looking forward for that day, for the refugees to return, the prisoners to be freed, and the occupation to end, and apartheid to be dismantled, where I can meet my friends from Gaza on the beach of Haifa and have a cappuccino. We have a date for that day, so we're looking forward to it.
There are few struggles with higher stakes than those waged by Indigenous peoples against their colonial occupiers. This is because the assertion of collective self-determination that they represent is a direct attack on the legitimacy of the dominant colonial power structure. For states, they are therefore existential threats and tend to be treated as such. The intense level of conflict that often results from these clashes can in turn rupture the illusion of social peace. This poses opportunities for revolutionaries, but also considerable risks. It draws clear battle lines, allowing states to mobilize their own national identities in order to allow for the intensification of repression. Non-Indigenous anarchists must be well aware of these dynamics, both in order to anticipate and help combat nationalist reaction, and to be able to act in complicity with all those who take up determined struggle against our mutual enemies within the ruling class. So at this point, we'd like to remind you that Trouble is intended to be watched in groups and to be used as a resource to promote discussion and collective organizing. Are you interested in getting more involved with Indigenous solidarity work in your area, or starting a group to provide sustained material support to folks on the ground in Palestine? Consider getting together with some comrades, organizing a screening of this film, and discussing where to get started. Interested in running regular screenings of Trouble at your campus, info shop, community center, or even just at home with friends? Become a troublemaker. For $10 a month, we'll hook you up with an advanced copy of the show and a screening kit featuring additional resources and some questions you can use to get a discussion going. If you can't afford to support us financially, no worries. You can stream and/or download all our content for free off our website, sub.media/trouble.